Welcome to the Pod Podcast, where we interview movers, shakers, and innovators and talk all things conversational user interfaces. I'm your host, Chad Oda, and today we're very privileged to have Wolf Paulus, the principal software engineer at Intuit. Wolf monitors emerging technology trends and best practices. He also helps to accelerate the discovery and adoption of emerging technologies across the organization. Specifically, Wolf focuses on UI, UX concepts beyond touch, so voice user interfaces, conversational user interfaces. Wolf also sort of previously held positions at HP, Motorola, and Patient Solutions. He also is an advisory member at the University of California, Irvine. So at that, Wolf, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So before we jump into the chatbot voice-related questions, I always like to ask sort of a unique question based upon our guest sort of background. So I was sort of looking through the type of things you worked on over the years, and I think you've always sort of sat on the cusp of some of these major platform shifts. And with that, I was curious, like, what sort of perspective has that given you, or insights, as we've moved from, graphical user interfaces at a basic level to more advanced ones, to mobile, and now to conversational user interfaces. And I have a feeling that you definitely have a unique insight, and I think it's probably evident in some of the content you put out, because unlike most people that are like super quick to jump to conversational user interfaces and say it's so great and let's move all of our use cases, I think you have a much more tempered approach to it. And I think you discuss some architectures in some of the content you put out.
Yeah, interesting. You're jumping right in here. So with these huge platform shifts, and well, you're obviously too young, but we jumped in like differently, right? When I remember way back when I was still in high school, and I was sneaking into the university next by into their computer lab, and there was brand new terminals, and they were like not being used because the students way back then, they had to submit their projects on punch cards. I mean, this is unbelievable. Now I understand, but think about that. Like, so at that time, it was going from punch cards to the keyboard. That was a platform shift, right? So going from punch to type, basically. And then many years later, the next platform shift happens, and we are moving from typing to touching. And that was obviously when here the mobile phone, right, was the next big thing. And now we are again we started, it's not the beginning anymore. We already like ways in now, but the next platform shift obviously is going from touch to talk. So it's from type to touch to talk. And you can almost imagine the next thing is probably to think, right? Where you go into a whole new different world. But with all these platform shifts, there also has been like a different hardware that was always involved in that, right? When we moved from the desktop and laptop to the phone, different form factor. And so that required or enabled us to use touch now, right? The BlackBerry fell a little short of all of that. With the keyboard on the phone, didn't really succeed. And now again, with voice, it's a different form factor, like ambient computing, where it doesn't really matter like the looks of the device. It blends in after a while. It doesn't matter really if it's stubby and short or tall and black. Not really. So it's these platform shifts seem to come with not only a different way of interaction, also the hardware seems to change significantly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, just that perspective, sort of helps to frame, how we look at, the platforms and sort of the succession between platforms. Because I think, especially myself getting into the space 2 years ago, I think we sort of see this great new technology paradigm and we're all rushing towards it. And it's like, okay, well, let's sort of step back, and sort of look at, okay, well, where do we start we just don't jump into the technology and say, let's make sure every use case is going to align to voice and chatbots. And I think a lot of people, often sort of think like that. And I think it's not atypical, right? I think any emergent technology or any new platform, people get really excited, oftentimes look past the use case, and I think that's maybe where we're sort of at right now with conversational user interfaces. So I think it's always interesting to sort of hear from someone that's sort of seen this sort of succession and sort of step back and say, okay, well, we've seen these different changes in the past, and, using that to sort of temper the way that we move forward. And I know certainly that's what your focus is at Intuit. So maybe that's a good segue. So how does sort of Intuit sort of think about these things in regards to conversational user interfaces, and what's their sort of strategy in adopting it into their ecosystem?
So I have the privilege to work for a group that we call Intuit Futures. And so the Intuit Futures group looks into technologies and trends that may influence our products and the whole market we are in years to come. So I'm not working on any product specifically, which is why I cannot really give you all the details in where we are with conversational user interfaces in our products like QuickBooks, or tax season is coming up, TurboTax. But I can tell you the journey that we have been on for a long time now. So we started looking into voice very specifically a few days after Apple launched Siri on the iPhone. And we thought, wow, what could that technology allow us to do if they would open up the experience? Like if we could really very deeply plug into this. And I mean, think of that, how frictionless now your interaction with your bank accounts could suddenly become, right? So that was, we started brainstorming really days after they launched. And that has never stopped. So ever since, we look into how could conversational user interfaces, how could voice specifically help our customers to get to their information quicker, more natural, and like I said, like totally frictionless. And if you look at an Google Home or on Alexa today, I mean, you walk into a room and you can start talking to it. There, of course, there's a lot of things that we would like these platform providers to improve upon. Security, biometrics, all that comes to mind, right? Where we see like barriers right now. Financial information on the Echo is currently really hard to get to, right? You don't want everyone who walks into a room being able to access your bank accounts, for instance. So there's things that really holding us back. But so we, like I said, we immediately started, we saw that Apple is not opening up. So we did experiments on Android phones, for instance, where speech recognition, speech synthesis were much easier to get by. And we started with the kind of the old technology where we built grammars sitting on top of speech recognizers that were built for IVRs. And so that was long before the more declarative approach that you saw with API.ai and now Dialogflow, or the dialogue builder that you have in the Alexa toolkit. So long before that, we started building grammars that we thought would allow us to test use cases with customers. And there were lessons that were learned the hard way, really. So give you one example. We thought it would be a good idea if our QuickBooks users, think of maybe a contractor, would be able to enter receipt data using their voice while, let's say, walking out of a Home Depot. So think you're the contractor, maybe you're remodeling someone's kitchen, the Anderson's kitchen. And so the idea was you walk out of that Home Depot, you have your bucket of paint that you need for that project in your hand, you pull out your phone and say, just purchased a bucket of paint at Home Depot, cost $19.80. I paid with my American Express credit card, and it's for the Anderson project. So it's like 5 data points that we need for every receipt that gets entered. We built the grammar for that. We handed the phone to a contractor without setting much expectations. Just told him, let's enter your receipt data using your voice. What do you think what happened? These guys started talking with what we call roboto voice. So, and that means they start $19.80 bucket of paint. So, and speech recognizers get a lot of information about how you transition from one word to the next. So the recognition really sucked. Right? They didn't like the experience whatsoever. And so the lesson that I think we learned building that early prototype was voice user interfaces don't really match with data entry, right? Data collection is not a favorable use case for voice user interfaces. So that was one of the lessons we really learned the hard way. And from that point on, we went to a much more rapid prototyping, though not building grammars or stuff like that, right? So more like the Wizard of Oz approach. And so, but that was a lesson hard learned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's really interesting, for a company such as Intuit. You guys are experimenting with conversational user interfaces. You guys see it as the new paradigm shift. And I know certainly you have, like this idealized vision of ambient computing, because I had read one of your recent articles, and I think you were mentioning, I think it must have been like the second CEO of Apple. They had that sort of tech demo video.
Yes.
Really, a conversational user interface. And, I think that sort of goes to maybe the idealized viewpoint of like where we can end up. But today, I think we're still, sort of on the road to getting there. So, maybe talk a little bit about that and like, what's your perspective in regards to, here's where maybe we can get to. Where do you sort of see that we're at now? Are we at the start of that sort of, journey, or are we sort of like maybe a couple of feet into that journey, or what's your perspective on that?
So currently we are as an industry a little bit confused, I think. When we talk about conversational user interfaces, we are talking about two things. A chatbot that sits maybe in Facebook Messenger where users still have to type, or a Slack bot, or maybe it's just a dialog box that you have added to your web page or to your online presence that you have inside of an mobile app. And on the other side, we have these voice-driven user interactions on these new kind of devices. And if you think about it, texting is in a conversation very different than talking, right? If I talk to you, I don't have to add an emoji to it. You hear it in my voice if I'm sarcastic or if I'm making a joke, right? Or right now, even better, you see my face. Like you get all my facial expressions with that. All that we don't have in a typical chatbot experience. That's why we often see, we have to add an emoji to it, or a chatbot responds with an emoji, right? Just to make sure the user understands, this was not meant totally seriously. So kind of don't take it the wrong way. Yeah. And that also means that we cannot easily just reuse all the intent recognition and the way we respond from a chatbot and move that easily into a voice user experience. Text and voice is different. And the same would be true if I talk to you and I ask you, where did you go for lunch? How much did you spend? You would say, I went to the deli and I spent about $12. About $12, right? If you have the same conversation with a chatbot, you're probably much more specific, because that information now goes maybe into my budgeting system, ends up in Mint or wherever. So you're much more specific. You say, I spent $11.80 maybe. So all this goes out the door if we talk about voice user interfaces, right? If you talk to an Alexa and say, hey, Alexa, what's the balance of my checking account? You probably don't expect that the Alexa would add the cents at the end, right? No, you say, there are $12,000 maybe in your account. Maybe it's 200, I don't know. But it's like you expect kind of a rounding that the conversation goes quicker and it's more natural. So that's one thing where I think we are a little bit confused trying to merge these things and be not really specific when we talk about it. And now where I think this goes in the near future is if you look at an experience like asking a Google Home or asking Alexa for the weather, the conversation goes pretty much the same, I think. The information that we receive back, we expect it to be precise, and of course it is. Neither of these companies own the weather information. They get it to some third party, weather.com maybe, I don't know. So it's not, we as customers really don't have to worry about that either system would not give us the same precise answer. So how do we decide? How would a customer decide this device is better for me than the other one? And so I think if, with all things being equal, form factor not mattering all that much, it's the likability that now becomes a differentiator. And that likability may be how much more you like a voice that you hear over another one. Or what I think is maybe more important, the empathy that comes with it. Right. So if, and in you mentioned this latest article I posted, I make show an example where a typical experience you hear maybe in your navigation system when you're on your commute home and it says you, there has been a fatal accident on the 101 North. And then you get, you will arrive at your destination in 2 hours and 40 minutes. You're on your fastest route. So you hear that information with the happiest of voices. Right? There's nothing happy about it. Somebody just died on the freeway. On top of that, I will be very late to my maybe important appointment. So there's no empathy in that. And there's two parts of this. One is we could maybe choose our words a little bit more carefully. And with that, I truly mean it, that we as developers of chatbots or voice user interfaces, we have to become wordsmith, very carefully looking at each and every word that we put into a response. Does this really match the intended attitude, right? So I would much more prefer if that voice maybe would have had a little bit of sadness to it. And we have ways to do that, to make it happen. So you slow down the voice a little bit, you lower the pitch, you kind of compress the pitch range, and suddenly a voice, like you hear me currently speaking, I'm lowering my voice, the pitch, the volume, suddenly I sound sad. So it's not really a big deal to make this happen. So we have to really look at ourselves, the things that we put out, and does the speech synthesis, if we use the voice user experience, or does the text that we put into a response, does this really match the intended attitude? So I think this is what I think will help differentiate a platform or a skill or an app on both sides, on the chat side and the voice user interface.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think all those are extremely prudent points. I like how you differentiate, voice user interfaces versus chatbots. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people are saying, hey, let's just make one experience on, a variety of channels, when there are significant nuances, right, that are native to the channel or native to the experience. And I think, there are technical, hurdles, as well as just hurdles in regards to what is good conversational user experience. And I think a lot of those things are still getting defined still, right? I think the heuristics and best practices, it's going to take some time to really define what is a good experience. But then I guess similarly, to your point, I think, also it's like, I think consumers don't really know, they don't have like a benchmark for an experience yet. So we're sort of going into these experiences and it's just like, can I ask it something like this or can I not, right? Because I think you did a good job. And if you don't mind sort of explaining, you have a very systematic way of looking at the different platform experiences. I remember you had mentioned in one of your articles that you see that voice is like level 0, if I remember correctly. And then above that is like 2D with.
Yes. Yeah.
If you don't mind explaining to the audience that sort of systematic thought process, I think that's a really interesting way to define what we're looking at here.
So if you look what's happening right now, we are moving into two different directions, like away from the desktop experience. On one side, we go into augmented reality or virtual reality. And we as Intuit Futures Group experiment in that space, of course, too. But that requires now that you put a headset on, that you have powerful hardware available to you. And that is what I call friction, right? So it's putting on a device, preparing myself, moving in a new space. It's not really as frictionless as talking to an Alexa, right? Where there's like no preparation required whatsoever. So these are the two really different dimensions we are currently kind of transitioning from the desktop laptop experience. So, and this 3D experience, that is what I think is kind of very interesting, but it has a lot of friction to it. Allows you, of course, a very detailed view of things. And so 2D was what we have today on the desktop 2D experience. And the 1D experience would be the touch experience that you have on your phone, right? There's many things that you can now accomplish on your phone that you used to do on the laptop. For some stuff, you rather still go into this 2D or maybe even in the future 3D experience. And then there's this, what I call the 0D experience, where you just talk to this device. It's not as precise. The view is a little bit blurry. So when I talk about we are rounding things to make the conversation flow nicer, that creates a little blur in a way. So yeah, that is where I think we are currently at with from 0D to 3D. It's a very interesting experience on both ends, of course.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's interesting maybe to note that it's just like, technology has always like served as like an extension to augment our cognition, but through those interfaces, sometimes we lost a sense of sort of humanity and connectivity. But to your point, it's almost like at odd ends of the spectrum, we're both trying to get back to that level of sort of more human connectivity, right? But so I think it's sort of interesting to note that, it's just like, we're finally maybe at a stage where, at least at the 0D level, where computers begin to sort of interpret how we want to communicate with computer systems versus, humans always trying to figure out the best method to communicate with computer systems. To your point with punch cards, I think that's probably maybe one of the most rudimentary ways that it's like, this is how we input data and communicate with the computer to get an output, right?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting inflection point where we sit right now, for sure. But, maybe sort of starting, before or sort of like going back a bit, curious how you sort of got into the space of just like, just conversational user interfaces or just sort of like human to computer interactions, because I was reading your bio, and somewhere in there, sort of towards the bottom, it said that you were working with a team in Russia to build a chatbot. I don't know if that was recent or if that was some time ago.
That was some time ago. It was shortly before the .com bubble bursted. And so we were trying to build what you would currently call a chatbot. Yes. So we already called it a virtual assistant. And this was kind of based on AIML, an acronym that you hear a lot today, but meant something different back then. So that was 1999, 2000. And AIML is also an acronym that is used for artificial intelligence markup language. And I think we still have it used today. Pandora bots.
Yes, I was going to actually mention that. We had Lauren on previously, and she had mentioned her father helped to pioneer that.
Yeah. So, and that is when I first learned about Dr. Richard Wallace, who built AIML. And that all, of course, broke apart. And the company was Artificial Life. That blew up. And so that work did not really continue. But AIML survived. And I met Richard later, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago at Speech Tech in when it was still in New York. And yeah, he had by that time, he, I think, released version 2.0, which was much improved. And I know for everyone who doesn't know about AIML, it's a declarative approach for conversation design. So it's a little bit different than what we currently do with intent recognition and then building responses, which is has much more like what we currently do is much more a slot-driven approach, which inherits much from how IVRs have been built. So Richard had a different idea, and it's more a system that allows you to build more a chit-chat kind of conversation, where he's trying to cover as much as possible. And so systems that compete for the Loebner Prize have often been built with AIML. So a very interesting approach. And this is how I basically got started with looking into bots and building systems that can more naturally have a conversation with you. Yeah, that's an interesting time. And so now we are kind of back trying to solve the same problems, having much better tools. And now being able to add voice to this is really incredible, right? Way back then, speech synthesis sounded awful. Speech recognition was not usable. So we made advances in those areas that are really cool. Right?
Yeah, I think it's certainly interesting, especially the fact that, chatbots really aren't new. It's just, if we look back to like Eliza, or we look back to sort of like the algorithms that a lot of the infrastructure is based on now, a lot of it is from like white papers and research papers from like the 1980s.
Yeah.
So it's sort of interesting to sort of see that progression. And, I had a conversation with Antoine Rowe, who was a researcher in this space for many years. And, he had always mentioned to me that for whatever reason, has been difficult, especially in the conversational space from the research side of things, to sort of commercialize those things for whatever reason, right? So I'm curious, like from your standpoint, I mean, like, why is it sort of taken so long to sort of finally get to this point? I feel like in 2014, everyone, bots were like the hype, right? VCs were investing in it. Companies were saying, we're going to automate all this stuff and it's going to be really cool. Why has it taken so long? I mean, and you've probably been, at the front row sort of watching this sort of emerge.
I think it's the tools really, or the shift in perspective. So if you think, why are we right now looking with really so many people, it's such a broad approach to this. It's not just one industry, right? Chatbots are really everywhere. So this kind of shift from going from an approach that IVRs had, where you had to build, what I said earlier, where you had to build these grammars. And now we have a system where you just have to describe the intent and let the system figure out really, well, you provide sample utterance and all of that. And not all systems are equal in that respect, I understand. But it's really a separation of concerns now, right? Before it was, you had to match exactly what was in the grammar. You could not deviate just by one word. And that made it very cumbersome. These grammars were awfully hard to build. And now you really have a total separation. You don't really worry about speech recognition anymore. You say, oh, these are the intents that I have to really build, that I have to understand, that I have to be able to recognize. But how the user is asking for it, there really is a separation of concern now. And that is what makes it kind of easy and fast to get into this space. What's currently still missing is kind of the other side, where you would be able to do the same thing to create the response, right? Where you kind of would create a response maybe as a JSON document or an XML document. And then you would have a similar system like we have going from speech recognition to intent recognition. You have a response and you create that response now that the user hears or reads automatically. So without this kind of wordsmith approach that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So there's where we currently don't have this automatic tool-driven approach.
Do you mean
we have
generation?
Say again?
Do you mean natural language generation? Is
yes.
That?
Yeah. And again, that means both, right? Natural language in written and in spoken form. Mm-hmm. So, but I think it's really that separation of concerns that made it possible for a broad industry approach to attack this chatbot problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that makes complete sense. You know, in addition to, you know, the tools, it's, you know, we also have like, you know, network storage, compute that are far cheaper, you know, than, you know, I can only imagine trying to run, you know, some sort of rudimentary voice user interface, you know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you know, how much, you know, computing power and how expensive that must have been.
Yeah.
Where it's just like these platforms are surfaced by major sort of incumbent technology companies, and sort of anyone from your mom and pop to sort of Fortune 50 company can sort of adopt. So I think it's really interesting to sort of see that progression. So maybe sort of getting back to current day, are there like any sort of initial successes or, you know, use case success stories that you can share that Intuit has sort of seen as you guys have sort of been on this journey?
Not really. First of all, like I said earlier, I'm not directly involved in any product development. Mm-hmm. And I also cannot share all the cool things that are in the pipeline, which I really would, but I can't. So maybe where I think where we need to go, right? And let me go back 30 years when Scott Cook, our founder, founded the company, and he said, I saw my wife struggling balancing the checkbook, and I thought there need to be a better way. And she was sitting on the kitchen table, and that very kitchen table still is in Building 7, our headquarters in Mountain View. And Scott is still in the company, so as his office, still heavily influencing where the company goes. And so imagine a similar problem today. I don't know, do you even have a checkbook? Or if you have one, do you know where it is currently? But there's, every now and then, there still is that one moment where you need to write a check, right? It's once a year, maybe. Maybe there's that contractor that you hired, that gardener that still does not allow you to pay swiping the credit card, right? We have a Go payment reader. There's other companies, Square comes to mind, right? Maybe that contractor does not have that technology, and you're required to write a check now. So you're sitting now on your kitchen table and wondering, oh, is it okay for me to write that check over $5,400? Am I covered, right? So wouldn't it be nice to now just talk to the room? Say, hey, Alexa, is it okay for me to write that check over $5,400? And now think of it. How much goes into answering that question, right? It's not just, do you currently have that balance? No, it's, you have to now think, oh, this check will hit my bank account maybe in 2 or 3 days. Who else is pulling from my account? When is the next payday? So there's much more that goes into that. But so it's a very similar problem to what Scott saw his wife struggling with. We sometimes still have that problem today, right? Or a simple question, is it okay for me to buy that expensive camera that I'm eyeballing for so long now? It's Black Friday, just over. Is it okay? Can I buy it? So those are questions that I think would be so cool if we could answer that very casually. And
yeah,
so that is where I see not just Intuit, but the whole industry will move to really naturally help you, not judge you in any way, give you good advice, right? So we hope there will not be a skill that will scolding you saying, you did not pay your credit card off last month. No, that's not. So empathetic, friendly advice. I think this is where we need to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting because you must be now maybe like the fifth or sixth person that I've talked to that's sort of really sitting at the edge and sort of peering over and saying, you know, what is this going to look like in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years, in 5 years? You know, and everyone that I've had the chance to talk to that's forward thinking in that manner. So I was recently talking to the former head of Alexa OS, who is now the CTO of LivePerson. And then before that, I was talking to Suhas Uliar, who's the VP of Oracle, who's running their bot stuff. And they're all saying the same thing that you're saying, right? It's like, we're going to get to a place where it's like the interface in the conventional sense doesn't really matter anymore, right? It's the message is far more important, and how we can interpret that message in a natural way, and how we can sort of give back that value or whatever is going to address that sort of, you know, question in a way that's very natural and empathetic and human-like. So I think it's interesting, you know, how, you know, sometimes I think, especially with conversational user interfaces, we get so much into the weeds, but I think the greater sort of paradigm shift is creating this like seamless, very natural ecosystem. And I think that for me makes me really excited to sort of imagine.
So look at how far we have. I mean, you can look at all the statistics. Where are these devices, the Echoes and the Google Homes, really shine? Where they're used for? Playing music.
Yeah.
So why is that? Because the Alexa team made it possible to link your music account directly, right? I don't have to say, Alexa, play my country playlist on Spotify. Right? No, I don't have to say on Spotify every time. No, I can say, this is my preferred music provider in my profile. And then I just say, hey, Alexa, play that artist or play that song. And it will start playing it frictionless. We need to be successful as we are with music in these voice user experiences. This needs to happen across the board. So, I mean, it would be super cumbersome if I had to say it all the time. Alexa, what's the balance of my Bank of America checking account? Ask Intuit QuickBooks. No, right? This is right. It needs to know where my checking account is located and who is my financial service provider providing me with that information. I just want to say, what's the balance of my checking account? Right. So we have to get there.
Yeah.
And so currently, two things are really holding us back, at least when it comes to financials. That is this kind of not being able to link my preferred. It could be a bank. Maybe you have all your stuff at Bank of America, or everything is at Wells Fargo. I don't know. You would just link that provider, or maybe you're spread a little broader. Then you need an aggregator like Mint would be. And then we get a whole picture of your financial situation. But now to make this frictionless available to you, we need to be able to link this directly, and then no invocation word required anymore, right? You just say the wake up word and the linking to the service provider happens automatically. And then we would know where your check-in account is. So this could be a very nice experience. So that's one thing. The other part, of course, is security. And for that, we need a much better biometric approach. And so if we recognize you by your voice, that's perfect. We don't have to ask for a password or a PIN. If that's not the case, we have to put some barriers between the person who is asking for the information and the information itself, of course. But so once we get these two things resolved, a better biometric approach where we can identify the speaker on his or her voice and linking service accounts just like we see it today been done with music. And that would, awesome, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm not talking just about financial, right? This is all the things where you have currently choices, but you as a consumer, like consciously made that decision. That is the thing, the entity where I want to deal with. Maybe you always travel using Southwest. That would be where I would like to know, is that flight on time? I don't have to say which one, right? At that airline and that flight. And so
you bring up a really interesting point here, because I think this is a huge issue right now with especially voice user interfaces, right? Is this issue with discoverability and how intuitive is it for me to access a skill, specifically on Amazon Alexa, right? And for it to understand or actually have like somewhat of an idea to make sure to pick the right skill and not force the user into this very like explicit, I have to say, well, I want to listen to, this radio station on the BBC Alexa skill, right? So I think the interesting point that you're making that, I just haven't thought about for whatever reason is the fact that if you just have access to that information about that specific person's persona and the places where they're at, now discoverability becomes a bit easier because it's now more predictive based upon the services they're already connected to.
Yeah.
Whereas right now it's like, there's not a whole lot of, in a holistic manner, like Alexa doesn't know, what my bank account is, and it doesn't know, what my preferred, well, I guess now it will preferred like music service, because I know they're finally going to add Apple Music, which is great because they had it for a while and I have that. But so I think that's a really interesting point. And I think that also gets back to this idea of ambient computing, right? I mean, I think that's this idea that we're trying to get to, but right now we have these very compartmentalized solutions. And while they were great in very narrow use cases, I think when you get that 0D experience, right, you just expect to treat it as such, right? So it's just like, I want to treat it as 0D, but provided the current ecosystem limitations, I'm stuck with like this small sort of way of using it, right? But I think once we have that expansion, provided the ecosystem and the connectivity and the extensibility, then it begins to get to that ambient computing paradigm where it's just like, all the value added services that these corporations and consumers are accessing is going to be rolled in and surfaced with these voice user interfaces. So I'm just excited to sort of see us make steps towards that. And I think it was interesting to your point about saying, well, if we have more information, maybe discoverability gets a lot better.
And so I don't want to shut out everyone else, right? This is not, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, well, if you build this, then Intuit becomes the financial service provider for all your questions, right?
Yeah.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying just, it would be nice to have, let's say, call it a default. Currently, this experience still sounds too much like a conversation with an IVR, right? We have to say the wake-up word, the invocation word, and even how I transition from the wake-up word to the invocation word is very specific. I have to say open, right? I used to be able to say call or talk to.
Mm-hmm.
We were experimenting with a skill that we called Sally. And so then we just said, Alexa, talk to Sally. And then because it sounded more naturally than open, like Alexa, open Sally. And then what does it mean open? And then the same voice, of course, you hear Alexa's voice. So it's still like, you still talk to that female character. I'm not opening her. I want to talk to her.
Yeah.
Right? So, and if I say this now, and she comes back and says, want to talk to your Aunt Sally? No, I was referring to the skill, not the aunt. And so I have to be very precise. Now, interacting with the skill or getting the skill to have this conversation with me. And so being able to have a default there would be really nice. And if you want to talk to a competitive thing, then you just mention it by name, right? Just like I can say today, play this song on Pandora or on iHeartRadio. So just by linking my account to Spotify, for instance, I'm not shutting anyone else out really. It's just I'm declaring this as my default if I'm talking about music in general. So, and I think this would be very helpful and would allow me to have a much more natural conversation.
Yeah, and I think this, your point, which you just said, also sort of goes back to the transition between platforms, right? Because where graphical user interfaces are very precise, right? I'm clicking on the specific thing and trying to migrate that paradigm and take people from a very precise level of interaction to one that's maybe less imprecise, right? And we see like when you even say open, right? That would be something that is like within this graphical user interface paradigm. It's like, but we have to make sure to create native interactions provided the platform, right? It's like, it's conversational. I'm not going to think about it like I'm accessing a website. So I think that was really interesting the way that you put that. And I think maybe a segue to that, just out of curiosity, like, are there any specific chatbots or voice user interfaces that you've used and you're like, man, that was actually a really good interaction. I really enjoyed that. Not to put you on spot, but just out of curiosity.
So going back maybe 3 years or so, I was still, at that point, I was still a Bank of America customer. And I had this experience really that I would really call delightful. So you pick up your phone, and I just wanted to tell them that I go on international travel and just make sure my credit card works over there. And I just said, oh, well, I give them the courtesy call, and otherwise I'm stuck. So nobody wants that to happen. And I was expecting this awful experience in the IVR, right? As we all do. And it started like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So you hear the voice and enter the last 4 digits of your check-in account number or whatever it is. Okay. So you pull out your ATM card and you type in the last 4 digits. And then she goes on and says, now enter your 4-digit ATM PIN. Okay. I entered my 4-digit ATM PIN, which I knew by heart. Okay, so not a big deal. So I'm now 8 touches in. And then the voice says, welcome, Wolf. Thank you for being a preferred customer. How can I help you today? And I was blown away, right? I was stunned, really. I had no answer to that because hey, voice prompt. You tell me what you want to hear, right? Talk to an agent. That's right. That's what you expect. Like checking, saving, credit, talk to an agent.
Yeah.
I was stunned. And so the conversation went on very smoothly. And I remember I said, thank you at the end. And very, very well knowing that I was talking to a machine.
Yeah.
I really said, thank you. And I still say thank you a lot to Alexa today.
Yeah.
Right? And today I say it maybe more often than not because I just want to hear her response. Which is random, right? Yeah. That's what I also like. So one of the principles of creating a good conversational user interface is add some randomness to it, right? And so it's her very brief response is no problem, or my pleasure, or glad to help, something like that. But it's different, right? And that is what makes it more natural, more interesting, right? So I don't want to hear her every time saying the same response, like "You're welcome," something.
Right.
There's no pleasure in that. But adding this little bit of randomness really ends a conversation politely. I really like that.
I think you touched on 2 things that you've talked about previously in your articles. Number one, I think it sounds like the thing that blew you away most was this likability, right? They knew you, there was empathy, and it didn't give you this rigid sort of conversation flow. And then the second thing that I thought was interesting was that you said thank you to it. And also, I think in one of your blog posts, you had said, the more thank yous you see may be sort of a litmus test to if you have a good experience, right? So I think that was a really interesting insight that you had shared in that blog post.
Yeah, if that's what you're after, right?
Yeah.
If you want to be a CUI, a skill, whatever bot that has that kind of empathetic relationship with its users,
Yeah.
if that's what you're after, then I think, yes, it is a good metric. If it will, I think, wear off over time.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to work hard to keep developing your skill, right? Keep looking at what are users really saying, what do they want, and that's also super important. Like, look at the log files.
Yeah.
If you can get to the information, what did the user really say that triggered that intent to be recognized? Maybe it was something completely different. So
Yeah,
it's I think that's a really important point. And if you get to a relationship with your users where they are polite, I think, yes, you are definitely on the right way.
definitely. And I know you're certainly going to be talking more about these best practices because you're going to be speaking at the Business of Bots conference that's going to be coming up here in a couple months in February.
Looking forward to it, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to meeting you in person when we're out there. But I guess to that point, do you have like maybe one or two other best practices that you're willing to share?
Yeah, why not? So when we started, I already said, make sure that you don't use your voice user experience predominantly for data collection, right? I think this is cumbersome, and think about all the pitfalls. Like, creating just an entry in your contacts is hard, right? How do you spell a name correctly? So you then have to, maybe you see it on the screen if you have one of these Alexa that have a screen, or you look at it later and say, oh, it's totally spelled wrong, and you have to go in and edit it. So data collection, maybe not such a good idea. Creating a little bit of randomness, we talked about that already. I think that makes it pleasant. Every time a little bit different. Create some excitement if you want. And be personal. Just like Bank of America was very personal to me, like greeting me by my first name, mentioning that customer relationship I had, like, thank you for being a preferred customer. Makes you feel good in a way, right? Makes you feel right at home. People kind of know you. That's what I think is what makes a conversation personal. And be personable. That means be kind of polite and maybe casual, depending on the persona that you want to be in this chat, right? Becomes, of course, part of your brand. Like everything, the colors that you put on your webpage is now part of your brand. The font that you are using, part of your brand. In a voice user experience, is the voice that you're using. Is it male? Is it female? What age do you think people will think if they hear that voice? Is it that young female, middle age? I don't know. And then where do you pause? Is there a little bit of empathy in that voice? Super important, right? That makes it personable. And more technically, make sure you keep context, right? So for us, that would mean if we have been talking about a check-in account for the last 2 or 3 terms, and then I say, did you see that refund from Home Depot? And so I would then expect that you look into exactly that account that we were just talking about, right? So that is the context, basically. And what else? I think a good rule of thumb is a general question deserves a general answer. So if again, in the financial space, if you would say, Alexa, what's my balance? This is a very unspecific question. So maybe I would then go and tally over all your accounts that I know of and give you just that one number back. If you ask me more specifically, like, what's my balance at one financial institution, that I would only look into that. So general question, general answer. The more specific it gets, of course, the more precise the answer has to be. And yeah, that also kind of builds trust in a way, right? So that's not true maybe for all industries, but we have to make sure we are correct all the time. Yeah. If you're wrong just once, that will for a long time put all the other answers that you create from that point on in question. So that's building trust, I think, is also an important part of it. And you said discoverability is a problem, not only for the skill, also once you know that skill exists, that app exists, how do I know how I interact with it? Mm-hmm. And that comes to, I think, setting expectations. Yeah. And if Apple did it so well with Siri, right? We all knew what her voice sounded. We all knew the first 2 or 3 things we could ask her long before we had her on the phone. Like, they really created this campaign that made her public. And I think this is super important. If, again, this lesson that we learned in such a hard way, if you just hand a phone to someone, start talking to it, they will probably do that in this robotic voice. And so set expectations, give them an example, show them how you would do it. So I think that is maybe the most important advice of them all, set expectations correctly.
Absolutely. So I see we're almost at the end of the hour here, but I want to sort of give you the floor. Where can people learn more about what you're doing? Where can they see you speak next? Where's yours?
I will be speaking, I don't know, it's in February at the Conversational User Interactions Conference, which is a super learning experience for everyone who can come. There's, let's say, maybe 300 or so participants, so it's not a huge conference. But of those 300, I guess half of them are speakers. Mm. And that is what really creates not this typical kind of conference thing where you have one speaker and you have an audience. It's more a conversation. So I learned so much from listening to them, hearing what they have been done over the year. And so that is it's a different kind of a conference. More relaxed, maybe. Talks are very short. And that is a learning experience, really, that I can only recommend. So it's Conversational Interactions Conference, happens in San Jose in February. And then it's the Bots Conference you mentioned, that's in San Francisco. Looking forward to that. And then we have in end of April, early May, Speech Tech in Washington. That is a huge conference focusing on AI and speech.
Is that Washington State or Washington?
No, Washington, D.C.
Okay. Got it.
So that happens end of April and beginning of May. All the big guns will be there, like Nuance and all these huge companies that are in this space for a long time. And they are still alive and kicking. So believe it or not, right? It's just like, and this is where you find companies also like Bank of America, that team that built that natural language IVR. And so you can talk to them. It's also a very good experience. I can very much recommend. You find me on wolfpaulus.com is my webpage. There I ramble about things. But yeah, that's it.
Wolf, hey, I appreciate you being on the podcast. But before I let you go, I always like to ask this one last question to all of our guests. I think certainly, when you're in a field that's emergent and things aren't always super clear and there's some ambiguity, what sort of keeps you motivated? What keeps you inspired on a day-to-day basis?
God, this is, what I can only, like what I told my son, what I can tell anyone is, if you find a field where you really enjoy what you're doing, it's not really work, right? It's like, it's for me, I can sit and work on that stuff after dinner, over the weekend, and I feel not burned out because I like it so much. and playing with these, I say playing really, because this is what it feels to me like what I'm doing. Playing with these devices and figuring out where they're still falling short a little bit, overcoming these things. And so it's I think a super exciting time. Every time these huge platform shifts happen, new players emerge. Really, it's you enable more people to use the technology, right? Think of how many more people can use an iPad versus a Windows desktop, right? So you broaden really the whole customer base. You get elderly people involved now. Using the Alexa is so simple, right? And they can use the Alexa spot to have a conversation with their family. This is, so I don't know, this is just always such an exciting time when these shifts happen. And I don't need any additional motivation really. This is keeping me up and running.
Absolutely. Wolf, I love it. I couldn't agree more. I appreciate you being on the podcast today, and I certainly look forward to meeting you in person in a couple
Me too, very much so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.